Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first meeting for this year for the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club. And it's a delight to welcome everybody here and indeed to see everybody again after an interval of some few months since our last meeting, and to start the year, I think it's fair to say, in style. And also in sunshine as well. They say, you know, April is the cruelest month and April showers and all that, but I think she's treated us quite kindly this week so far. So, and it's an additional pleasure to be here on such a beautiful evening. But we'll start as we mean to begin. So I would like to begin by introducing our speaker for this evening, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Sara Sheridan. Sara Sheridan is a writer in command of multiple genres, though perhaps she's best well known for her contributions to the genres of crime writing and historical fiction. In the former, her 9-part series Mirabelle Bevan, a crime noir mystery series set in the 1950s, was published from 2012 to 2021. And an example of the latter, which is perhaps particularly apt for us this evening, of her historical works, is The Fair Botanists, published in 2021, so nearly 200 years since the historical moment in which the novel is placed. And for those who've not read it, not to give too much away, for those who've not read that novel, it's a novel situated in the Edinburgh of 1822, when the town is all anticipation for two things: the King's visit and the flowering of a plant at the Botanics. And our very own Sir Walter Scott, who is a character in that novel, is, I think it's fair to say, decidedly more excited about one than the other. However, as well as situating historical characters within her fiction, Sara Sheridan also creates characters to tell the stories of those often unrecorded by history. And tonight, Sara reflects on her process of creating historic writing in the setting in the age of Walter Scott. So, Sara, it's a delight to have you here, and welcome to the Scott Club. Thank you very much.
It's lovely to be here. My mother was a great member of the New Club. She used to come and drink gin and play bridge. And she was very naughty every time she came back. She was always kind of giggly. I don't know what she'd actually been. Thank you for having me. I think I'm going to talk tonight really about the process of writing historical fiction, why historical fiction is so important, and obviously it was something that Walter felt was very important as well, and then move on a little bit into that Edinburgh of the 1820s. I have to admit, I'm a little bit high today. I finished a book. I finished a novel that's going to be out next February, and it is again set in Edinburgh, but this time in 1837. And Walter does feature in the prologue, and I've brought a little bit that nobody's heard yet. So somewhere along the way, I'm going to read you the little bit of this prologue. In the Fair Botanists included a lady, Charlotte Scott, and of course I consider her very long-suffering. I think he must have been quite a difficult man because he was so enthusiastic about everything else. And this is the story of Charlotte, the day that Walter uncovers the crown in 1818 in Edinburgh Castle, goes up and finds the honours of Scotland in Edinburgh Castle, and what Charlotte is doing that day. So we'll have a little shot at that later. First of all, I have to say, being a creative, I have a lot of friends who are writers and musicians and actors and live a very creative life. And I suppose the one thing that we all have in common, and probably have in common with Walter, is we are all weird kids. We were the weird kids. And I was a weird kid. I was a weird kid at school, and I was a weird kid within my family. I have 2 younger brothers who are tremendously sensible. They're the kind of little boys, well they're men now, but they were the kind of little boys. My mother used to open the back door in March, fling out a ball, and they would disappear and come back in muddy in October. We hardly ever saw them. Mum loved that. And I was this odd child who just was obsessed with stories. I was always making little books and reading things out loud. And Mum was dyslexic, and she didn't really know what to do with me. My mother didn't have a great feeling for story, to the point, in fact, she had a particular form of dyslexia that didn't allow her to follow the progression of a story. And her favourite television series because of this was Columbo, because they tell you who died and why they died at the beginning. And she didn't have to worry about it for the rest of the episode. That was Mum's favourite thing. So she didn't know what to do with me. And she had a particularly difficult time. I was about 9 and she came into my bedroom and she flung off the covers to get me up for school and opened the curtains, and I crawled across the top of the bed, dragging my legs behind me, and I said, "Mum, you're going to have to send me to Switzerland, I cannot walk." And she thought, "Oh my God, what am I going to have to do with this kid?" And then her eyes moved to the side, and there was a copy of Heidi. And I had been reading this book, and I just thought to myself, I would be away from these dreadful, smelly brothers, muddy brothers. I would be sent up a mountain if only I could lose the use of my legs. And I would be able to eat cheese, and there would be a grandfather, be quite a sexy little goat boy. I think he was about, at the point where I was sort of slightly interested in that. And she thought, I'm going to have to do something with this kid about these stories. And she did something that was terribly brave, really, for somebody who can't read very well. She took me to Morningside Library. I had a little breakdown in Morningside Library the first day. When I went in there, I had never seen so many books. And apparently they had to give me a biscuit and some of that orange juice that they don't give to kids anymore because it's really dangerous. And I said, I don't know how I'm going to read all of these books, because that was then my kind of childhood. The rest of my childhood really was walking down to Morningside Library. Thank God it was the 70s, because you would not let your kids walk 20 minutes there and 20 minutes back on their own at that age now. So I'm very lucky actually that I was born when I was. In terms of writing history, I suppose my interest was really piqued by my father, who was a very difficult man, a very clever man. He had a particular magical superpower, and I'm going to tell you what it was. He was brought up on the Portobello Road Market in London, and his father, who was basically a West End gangster in the 30s and 40s, had won in a poker game 18 licenses to stalls on the market. And Dad, in his very young years, his job was to get up in the morning and go and get the stall holders tea and bacon rolls. This is the point, you've probably all been to Portobello Road Market, and today it's super chic and it's full of tourists and it's all very above board. This is the point at which the Portobello Road Market is in fact a thieves' market. And it opens at 4:30 in the morning and goes on until the police change shifts. And basically it was a sort of 3-hour window when the police weren't going to be around quite so much, and everyone would bring everything they nicked, and that was what the market was. Anyway, Dad discovered during the course of his childhood that he had this magical superpower, and it was this: he could remember any object. And he went on to have a hugely successful career actually in antiques and in jewellery, because of this background that he came from. I remember as a kid going to auctions with him all over Europe, and he literally would see objects that he'd seen before. I was once in Edinburgh with him, and he said, "Oh, that Delamere teapot, I last saw that Delamere teapot in 1963. Harry Parry bought that teapot. It was £2, 10 shillings and whatever. So there was a mark on the underside. They'll never have been able to buff that out. You go up and turn it over and there'd be the mark on the underside." So, because Mum couldn't read, she couldn't tell us bedtime stories. We couldn't read bedtime stories, so Dad used to tell us bedtime stories. But Dad was really only interested in objects. And so he used to come home and he would pull out of his pocket whatever he had bought that day. It could be a tiara. It's very good if you're a little girl and it's a tiara. It could be a comb, silver comb. It could be a flintlock. My brothers liked it when it was a flintlock. And he would say, "Let me tell you about this object. Let me tell you how it was made. Let me tell you about who owned it." And he would tell us these stories about these objects. And this, I suppose, instituted in me a real sense of where we come from and what is left of us after we go. So when I started to write, I didn't write historical fiction at all. I wrote contemporary commercial fiction. The first book that I wrote was called Truth or Dare, and it was a kind of Thelma and Louise road trip around Scotland and Ireland. And it took in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, 2 women in a car, and one of them's a psychopath. You know one of them's a psychopath, you just don't know which one. I had great fun writing this book, and it did very well. It was nominated for a prize, and it got Scottish Libraries Award, and it went into the top 50 and all this kind of stuff. And so I started to get these contracts to write more of these books, because once you've written a book, publishers just want you to write the same book again if they've managed to sell lots of them. And I was about 3 or 4 books in, and I realised that all these books I was writing had big historical backstories. You know, Truth or Dare is really about what happens to you if in your culture, for the Irish girl, you have this war going on the whole time. You can't trust anyone. People are pulling each other out of the houses and kneecapping each other. What does that do to your family? And it was about over the generations. And I wrote a book set in Edinburgh called Mark Linsky's Pockets, which is vaguely based on, partly on the story of Esther Henry, who's a city councillor, but also had an amazing shop up on the high street. She was a big antique dealer. My mother, when she died, took the inventory for her estate, and she had bought a huge amount of stuff at the King Farouk sale in the 1950s, sold royal Egyptian jewels that were stowed in old filing cabinets down in the basement of her shop at Mulberry House up on the high street. Mum said you would go to the filing cabinet and there would be a thing on it that said like emeralds or something, and you'd open it and it would just be emerald necklaces all the way back. So, oh, sorry, I got carried away quite there with the King Fruit sale and suddenly thought, oh, what was I talking about? What was I talking about? Were you listening? Anybody listening there? Anyway, I'd written all these books and I realised that my real interest was in the historical backstory that was contained within them, and I thought I'd had a genius idea. I would write a historical novel. And I went down to London to see my editor, who was at Random House at the time, was published by Random House initially. And I thought I had this great idea. The headquarters of Random House in London is a giant glass building. It's known in the industry as the Death Star. And the reason is it's one of the most corporate places you could possibly walk into. And I trotted in, fresh off the train from Edinburgh, delighted with myself, saying, I'm going to write a historical novel. And my editor, who was called Lynn at the time, said, I'm not publishing that, I want another one of these, which was the stuff I'd been writing. And I was on the way home feeling a bit depressed on the train afterwards, and I thought, this is a really difficult job. Writing sounds great, but it's pretty tricky. You're self-motivated, you have to work very hard, it's all on you, you can't subcontract out anything. You write to very tight deadlines, there's no pension plan whatsoever. And but the one thing about it is you can do whatever you want. You can do the thing that you love. And I thought, sod it, I'm going to write a historical novel, and I did. And Lynn said to me, well, I'm not going to buy it. 2 years later, when I'd written it, she bid on it, but she didn't get it. So I bid, it was her own silly fault. Anyway, and that started my journey, I suppose, into the archive. And we have some wonderful libraries in Edinburgh, some fabulous archives. In fact, all over Scotland we have really amazing material. But a lot of the archives that we have are really very much based in male history, the kind of history that we learn in schools about acts of parliament, about wars, about people who are powerful, all about people who are white, not so much about the women, not so much about working class history actually at all, or queer history, or any of the other things that make up a rounded, normal, sensible society and culture. And I suppose I became activated. I suppose I became radicalised in the library. And I decided that I wanted to write some of these stories. I wanted to write into the history that existed, around the skeleton of the things that we were taught in school, the stories that hadn't been told, and try and resurrect some of the voices and the complexity of our history that we just weren't being taught. In 2019, I had started to write the Mirabelle Bevan crime series, and I had an editor who I was working with, a guy called Jamie Crawford, and he had come to Bloody Scotland because he wanted to get a whole load of Scottish crime writers together and to promote historic Scotland. We were all supposed to write a tiny, short story set in a historic environment Scotland property. And we would write this story, and he was going to put them all together in a book, and it was fabulously successful actually in the end, because the Americans thought it was catnip, all these murders in Scottish castles. When the book came out, we went on a tour. We did several events in all these different properties. And I'd never toured a lot of them before. And when I got back to Edinburgh, I took Jamie to task. And I said to him, I took him out for coffee actually at Contini's, and I said, I'm really disappointed in all these properties. I said, I see that, you know, they've got all these big stories, but where are the women? Where are the children? Where are the working class people? Where's all the rest of the stories? Like, was nobody gay? And none of that in any of the, or very, very little, unless you're Mary Queen of Scots or St. Margaret. And I said, I just don't think it's good enough. And Jamie said, I'm going to think about this. And I thought, oh, bloody hell, he's going to go, you know, he's never going to speak to me again. I've annoyed Jamie, he's going to go off. But fair play, he rang me back. 3 weeks later, he rang me back and he said, I've been looking, you're absolutely right. What do you want to do? So we went back to Contini's and another coffee. And Jamie had seen a really interesting project, and the project was by an American feminist called Rebecca Solnit, who's written a number of books. And she had remapped the New York subway, one line of the New York subway, and all stops on this subway in real life were named after men. So she renamed them all after women and told the history of New York through the story, the remapping of this subway. And Jamie said to me, you should do Scotland. I think you should do Scotland. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a big job. But out of my mouth came, I'd love to do that, thank you, yes. And I spent the next probably 9 months, no sleep, with very large maps of Scotland all over my wall. And I'm afraid I got radicalised even more. The book that resulted is called Where Are the Women? And it is a remapping of Scotland with 1,600 stories of our amazing foremothers. I go into school with the news. I give these lectures to school kids about it now, and I say to them, you come from amazing, you just don't know, you just haven't been told these stories. There's also always one cheeky wee bastard right at the front, wee boys, honestly. And that cheeky wee bastard at the end, we do questions, and he puts up his hand and he says, what's this got to do with me, miss? He thinks he's really clever. And I say, these are your grannies too. You know, male history isn't for, you know, men, and women's history isn't for women. We come from all of this. We come from something that's really complicated and really interesting. And so, right after I'd written this book, I met an editor from London who was called Emma. And she wanted somebody to write a 19th century novel set in a botanic garden. That was what she wanted to commission. And my agent had met her, and poor Emma, she had been to Kew, she had been to Chelsea, she had been to like a zillion botanic gardens all around the UK. And they had all said, look, we're far too busy with the plants, please go away, we're not interested in your stupid idea for a novel. But she got to Edinburgh and they said, come in, we have a herbarium, we'll make some tea, because they have a very large programme for the gardens to interact with the creative community. And so she decided she wanted to set it in Edinburgh. And I met her and I said, oh, I'd love to write this book. This sounds great. Botanic gardens. And she said, yeah, I want stories of women. And I said, well, that sounds really very much up my street. And I said, well, you know, the women's interactions with botanic gardens would be botanical illustration and making perfumes, and perhaps a certain amount of apothecary work that could be done by women. And also nursery women. Some of the large nurseries in Edinburgh in the 1820s were run by, in fact 2 of them were run by matriarchs of large families that ran the nurseries for the plants. It's very big business in the 1820s, horticulture. And I wrote it on a napkin. And she went off to London. Quite often you meet editors and they say, oh, I want to write a book about bananas. And if you're not an idiot, you say, oh, I've always wanted to write a book about bananas, right? And you chat to them about it for a bit just to see if it's something you might be interested in. So she went off back to London and I thought, oh well, let's see what happens. 3 days later, my agent rang me and she said, oh, your contract's in. And when you get a contract to write a book, it says, you know, the title of the book. And the book, the original title on the contract was The Gardens. I think this book, The Fair Botanists, is still called The Gardens on my laptop. So it's The Gardens, and they tell you when you want you to deliver, how many words. It was 100,000 words, and then it says, and then there's a description, you know, and she had written everything on the napkin. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to put all this in now. Because I'd just been like riffing, I'd just been talking about, you know, the women who were living in Edinburgh in the early 19th century. And I think I had already decided on 1822 because Edinburgh loves a party in August. And George came at the end of August. And I just thought, it just feels right to write about the run-up to an exciting event. So many people have written about George's visit. And I just didn't want to do that again, really. And so I said, okay. And I started to write the book. I think I wrote 10,000 words. And then I thought, I better check. So I sent her the 10,000 words. And she said, this is a lot better than I thought it was going to be. I thought, thanks very much for that vote of confidence. And then proceeded to spend several weeks, right up actually until the advent of lockdown. In the archive at the Botanics. They have an amazing archive there with great help and support from the archivists down there, particularly Mirabelle, who just knows everything. And I suppose I discovered a web of intrigue. Scott was very involved in the Botanic Garden. His uncle, Daniel Rutherford, of course, was the Regius Keeper. He was dead by 1822. But during Scott's upbringing, he was very much around and about the gardens and knew a lot about the gardens. And of course, he was the architect of George's visit and therefore was really important. So I started to look into this character. Now, I had read some of Scott's books, and he's not a kind of historical novelist, I'm not going to lie. There's a really interesting creative division. And I think it's fair to say it runs right through the whole of history, actually. There's people who are creative and people who are non-creative, and we often talk about the differences between these people. But within those communities, there are people that have a different distinction. There are people who are conformist, and there are people who are non-conformist. I can tell you that in the archive, the non-conformist creatives are the ones that we get really excited about. I recently was luckily appointed at the Alistair Gray archive. They do a creative commission every year, and I was the creative commission for this year. Although, if you're the creative commission for this year, you do all the work last year. So, and I was in the Alistair Gray archive. He's a fabulous writer. I don't know if you've read Lanark, and my favourite is Poor Things. But I also like Something Leather in 1984 Janine. He was quite bananas. I mean, he really was quite eccentric. And I think he captured something of, I don't know, a spirit that, and a complexity in his writing that I think is very difficult to get down on paper and to communicate to people. He was very interesting politically to me, and also very interesting because of his views on place. He was Glasgow's city recorder for many years. So he worked for the council and recorded the city of Glasgow in a series of paintings and also in some of his writings. One of the things that he said that I think is really interesting with regard to Edinburgh, although he said it about Glasgow, is that when you read about New York or Paris or London or any of these big cities, or by the time you visit these cities, you have already visited them 100 times because you've read about them. And you've seen images of them, and you've seen them in pictures and in film. But in Glasgow, you're only ever allowed to tell one story. We tell that one story. We tell the story of the terrible slums and the awful poverty and the deprivation. And I think that Gray started a movement, really, to tell a more rounded view about Glasgow, and by extension a more rounded view about Scotland and about Scotland's history and where Scotland comes from, what it's really about. I have a friend who arrived last summer from LA, and he was going to a wedding in the Highlands. He flew straight into the Highlands, and he phoned me and he said, I'd like to come down. We moved to Glasgow 2 years ago. My husband and I, he said, I'd like to come down for lunch to Edinburgh. And I said, oh, I'm not actually living in Edinburgh. We've moved to Glasgow. And he said, have you not read Shuggie Bain? And I thought that was great. I thought that was exactly Alistair's point, that we don't tell complicated enough stories. And so Scott, I suppose, I consider him very much a conformist creative. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are some great conformist creatives out there. but it is a difference in ideology. He's very much telling the main story, and he's telling a very patriarchal story. And I'm fond of him because he was so generous. He was a hugely generous man, but he is the benevolent patriarchy. And as someone who is aware of the women, I feel I need to stand against that in some kind of way. But writing him was fun, and it was a real touchstone as well, because the Fair Botanists has now been sold all over the world, and of course people come back to me and ask questions and send letters and all kinds of various things that they're interested in with the book. And very often, it's strange, but they haven't heard of Scott. They've heard of Burns. Burns is dead by the time of the books, but one poor character discovers that he's Burns' illegitimate son. He's absolutely raging about it. Of course, Burns put it about town quite a bit in Edinburgh and had more than one illegitimate child in the city. And so they've heard of Burns, but they haven't heard of Scott so much. They just don't know about Scott, and I think that's really interesting. In terms of how we fashion Scotland, because Scott's vision of Scotland, they certainly do know about. They certainly, believe in the whole lore of the tartan and the Highlanders and all this, the romantic Highlanders and all this stuff, which came so fluently from his vision of the world and remaking what he saw around him. I'm going to read from the book now. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book first. So, this isn't the first book after the Fair Botanists. After the Fair Botanists, I wrote a book called The Secrets of Blythewood Square, which is about a very beleaguered young lady in Glasgow whose father dies, and she's a member of the Free Kirk, and she discovers that secretly he has a large pornographic and erotic collection hidden behind a secret door in his library, and she has to get rid of it, and she just doesn't know how to get rid of it, and it takes her into all kinds of strange places she never thought that she would end up going. Part of the book as well is set in Edinburgh. It's in the genesis of photography. It's set in 1842 up at Rock House, actually, in Robert Adamson and David Octavius Hill's studio. And last month I had out a book called On Starlit Seas, which is set in the chocolate industry. The chocolate industry in the 1820s, I was very glad to be back in the 1820s, is tremendous fun. They're all spying on each other. And there was a strange connection actually between that book and the Fair Botanists. The Regius Keeper of the Botanic Garden in 1822 was a guy called Robert Graham. And my chocolate smuggling heroine, really, in the book is called Mariah Graham, and she turned out quite unexpectedly to be Robert Graham's cousin's wife, which I didn't know until after I had read the book. I'm one of those annoying historical novelists who never stops researching a book even after it's out. It's slightly frustrating for me, I have to say, but happily, On Starlit Seas was a reissue, and I was able to go back in and write a new historical note for it, to bring in the story of Robert Graham and the Graham family a bit more. And the next book, the book I'm going to read you from, is called The Jewel Keepers. And we all know, everyone in this room must know, that in 1818 in February, Walter uncovered the honours of Scotland in Edinburgh Castle. It was a rather drunken lunch in Glasgow, I'm afraid. My editor had come up from London. I'm afraid Emma got headhunted, and so my editor's now called Jo. Jo came up, we went out for lunch, and I had decided my next book was going to be set in 1916 in Edinburgh Zoo. And I was very enthusiastic about this proposition. And we went for lunch, and I told Jo all about Edinburgh Zoo in 1916, how all the keepers had gone off to war, and there was these two girls who had to look after the zoo, and how the penguins got asthma. And the wolves escaped, and there was a golf course running through the middle of the property, and all kinds of things. And she could see she was not buying this proposition one bit. And eventually I said to her, "What do you want?" And she said, "Glamour, I want glamour, I do not want asthmatic penguins." And I said, "What kind of thing?" And she said, "Jewellery, jewels, just jewels, just something nice. Do you know anything about jewellery?" And I was like, "I haven't told you the story about Dad. I know a lot about jewellery, right?" And she said, "When would you set it?" And I said, "Well, in 1818, Walter Scott uncovered the honours of Scotland in Edinburgh Castle. They've been walled up since the Act of Union. What if there was a Queen's crown as well?" And she went, "That's the most amazing thing anyone's ever done. How did you come up with that?" And I said, "I didn't come up with it, it's real history." Anyway, the line I had come up with, of course, was what if there was a Queen's crown? And I had this idea for the honours, of course, had gone missing over several times. It wasn't the first time that they had been rescued and spirited away in the face of the English arriving and going to melt them down or steal them or do whatever the English were going to do. And so I thought, well, if there was a Queen's crown, a consort's crown, it could have been spirited away separately. What if it was spirited away by some posh women? Let's call them the Mackenzies. And what if during the Jacobite uprisings they still have this crown but they lost it? And then the successive generations had to spend their time trying to find out what happened because it's their family's honour. So that's the book that she bought, that's The Jewel Keepers, and it takes you all around Edinburgh. And it took me to some really interesting places I hadn't been before, including lots of bits of Edinburgh Castle that you're not really supposed to be able to go into, which was really good fun. And up a winch on Heriots so that I could have a proper look at the statue, and down to Holyrood to look at the abbey down there. But this is from the prologue of the book, this is from the very beginning. And the prologue is Walter uncovering the honours. And this, of course, is what's going on at home. The Mrs. Mackenzie call on Mrs. Charlotte Scott at North Castle Street, knowing full well the reason that Edinburgh's most august poet is out this afternoon. The unwed middle-aged sisters have little respect for Scott, who they tolerate on account of the fact he's a lifelong acquaintance and because he's loyal to his younger brother Thomas, who has been nothing but trouble to the Scott family since he was delivered in Mrs. Scott Senior's birthing chamber at George Square more than 4 decades before. However, lately, the fawning nature of Scott's friendship with the Prince Regent has been the sisters' uppermost reason for disrespecting their old family friend. Prince George treats his wife, poor Caroline of Brunswick, appallingly, and the Mackenzies are not the Prince Regent's only female subjects to find his behaviour unacceptable. The women were horrified 3 years before when Jane Austen, a writer they'd heretofore admired, dedicated her novel Emma to George in the most obsequious terms. Of late, Scott can hardly get through a game of cards or a turn on the dance floor without mentioning the Prince. The Mackenzies consider his unquestioning friendship with His Royal Highness undignified at the least and tantamount to wife-beating on bad days. "I don't know how Charlotte puts up with it," Ailey has been known to mutter after a salon or a dinner party or a simple reception, occasions when the women come across the Scots socially. While they've come to expect nothing more from Walter or his brother Thomas than what Saoirse Mackenzie, the older and more considered of the sisters, calls disappointments, they are, however, both extremely fond of Charlotte, who, being French, is an excellent pastry chef. This personage is said to travel with the Scots when they come up to their house on North Castle Street, bringing a supply of good Borders butter so that Mrs. Scott need never want for a decent friand. Today Charlotte, chic in a salmon-pink Empire Line frock embroidered with tiny gold stars, cannot help glancing out of the drawing room window towards Castle Rock as she greets her guests, her dog always at her heel. Ailey and Saoirse, despite their misgivings about Walter, were instrumental in him realising the location of the lost crown. It was a historic letter that Saoirse unearthed that mentioned the honours. She passed this on to Walter, knowing that he was a hound to the chase in the matter of anything royal, and in truth a thorough antiquarian with skills required to take on the job. After months of investigation involving a survey of Edinburgh Castle's chimneys, among other exploits, Walter finally received permission from the Regent to break through the wall and potentially unearth the royal crown commissioned by James V almost 3 centuries before. Proper royals, Ailey calls the Stuart dynasty. George, or is mostly known behind his back, Prinny, is Hanoverian, his great-grandfather's ascension to the throne never fully forgiven by the Stuart faithful. Edinburgh has been a Hanoverian city since Anne Stuart's death in 1714. Its citizens prefer to back winners, but beneath the surface there remains a secret and mostly silent thrum of Jacobite descent. George's great-grandfather was 19th in line to the throne, his distant claim successful entirely on account of his Protestant faith, and while pragmatic, the citizens of Scotland's capital have a strong sense of justice. Though these days few would change the Hanoverian accession, Mistresses Mackenzie are not from Edinburgh. They're Highland lasses. It's been 4 generations, and they know the Stuarts will never reign again. The last of the line is a cardinal and childless. Still, Saoirse always says, making the objection without having an end to her sentence, a family trait. Ladies, Charlotte Scott greets them and offers champagne. She's bought several cases of a new vintage known as Veuve Clicquot. A few of the corks are printed with shooting comets, a favourite motif. Charlotte is an astronomical enthusiast who frequently visits the observatory on Calton Hill. The wine is made by a widow who took over her husband's vineyard after his death. The first bottles were purchased out of charitable sentiment, but the widow, it turns out, makes excellent wine. The tiny bubbles, a particular delight. Charlotte pours 3 delicate glass saucers and smiles as the froth shifts on the surface. She proposes a toast. Schiehallion. The sisters clink. Last year, Saoirse gifted Charlotte Scott a watercolour of the Perthshire mountain, which the women agreed they would one day climb and picnic at the summit. It has become a rallying cry. Do you think it's really there? Ailey asks, moving swiftly on to the reason the sisters have made this social call. The question comes too quickly for Saoirse, who considers Ailey overly direct. Her cheeks redden, for it unmasks them. Charlotte, clearly unaware, gives a Gallic shrug. If it's there, Walter will uncover it, she says. She says this in a tone that recognises that if he does so, her husband will be unbearable. He's a good man, but his moods undulate like the lowland hills round their country home. Charlotte would never admit it, but she prefers the troughs to the peaks, for they're easier to live with. I was said to talk for 40 minutes, and I see I have managed to do that. However, we're going to leave a little time for questions. Has anybody got any questions? Gentleman at the back.
At the back. Wonderful. More people are going to read me for your take on Edinburgh. I'm very, very sure of it. But I just wonder, to the credit of your own sex, which is, have you any heroines of non-conformist creative ladies in the past couple of decades? For example, I'm thinking about Olive Douglas, that's the sister of John Buchan. I've got written here Margaret Oliphant, and I've got written also Dorothy Dunnett.
Oh, I love Dorothy
You've never
Dunnett.
done archiving, and she was a great person. If you go in the National Library, you'll see her work and her handiwork. But it's just, who would have been a role model for yourself?
Yeah, role model for me. It's a really interesting question. I mean, thank you, it's a lovely question actually. So I often think when I started to write Where Are the Women, I assumed that I'd had a fair go actually. I was brought up in a very wealthy family in Edinburgh, and I went to a private school, and I assumed I'd had a fair go. And then I realised, as I was growing up, those 2 dirty brothers of mine, those little smelly sportsmen, everywhere they had walked in Edinburgh, there were statues that looked like them. And those statues said to them, you can be a scientist, you can be a minister, you can be a politician. And in Edinburgh when I was growing up, and even now in fact, there were no statues to non-royal women in central Edinburgh, not a single one. And so we didn't have that story, we didn't have that. And there's been studies done, academic studies that sort of look into the issue of how important that is. It turns out the urban landscape that you live in, or if you live in a city, is really important to you growing up. Probably as important as reading books. It's really important that you see people like you who have achieved. And so the subtitle for Where Are the Women is an imagined Atlas of Scotland. And it is that, it is 1,600 women, most of whom I had never heard of. In Edinburgh, well, as a writer first of all, and not particularly in Edinburgh, but I would pick Dorothy Dunnett, but I would also pick Lorna Moon. Lorna Moon was a short story writer. She wrote a novel, the novel wasn't great. Rebecca West, fabulous journalist who was schooled in Edinburgh. You know, so you have these big names in writing, but I don't remember seeing any of these names when I was at school. I don't remember these books being on our reading lists. I just don't remember seeing any of it. I don't think it was there. And so later you find these treasures, you find these books, and quite often, you know, women read novels more than men. About 86% of novels are bought by women. This is a very unusual audience for me. Usually the audience is mostly women because it's women that read novels, right? So I should have known more of these names, I suppose, and it just wasn't there, wasn't around me. And Lorna Moon, I think, is the best short story writer I've ever read. She's absolutely fabulous. She actually comes from Aberdeenshire. She was brought up in Strichen, and she wrote a book called Doorways in Dromarty, but those doorways are not in Dromarty, they were all in Strichen. And when the book came out, it was banned from Strichen Library because it was too real. And she writes these brilliant little scenes where she just ratchets up the action on tiny things like, what hat is this lady going to wear to church? And why is that really important? Will she wear the hat? Will she not wear the hat? It's no surprise to me that she went to America and actually ended up in LA writing screenplays, because you can see the way that her stories are constructed. She had a kind of natural sort of feel for that. I'd never heard of Lorna Moon until I wrote Where Are the Women, and I wrote her into the book before I read her short stories. And afterwards, I had a huge pile of books that I had to read from women that I had discovered because of my research, but I had never known about before. So as a writer, I feel that if we don't put more women on the reading lists in schools and in colleges, then we're just not, you just don't have, if you can't see it, you can't be it. Or if you can't see it, it's more difficult to be it. One of the other things that I discovered during Where Are the Women is there was a big crowd of Victorian women who thought they were the first at things. So they had succeeded for the first time in doing things, but in fact there had been medieval women and Georgian women who had done these things before. This demonstrates this is not a new problem, right? When women die, we forget their achievements very, very quickly. It's kind of a cultural norm. Must be about 5 years ago now, it was the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and they had a special on Radio 4, and I had Radio 4 on, and Tony Blair was on talking about peace in Ireland and how important it was, and all the work that had been done, and everyone was on talking about how supportive they were and what great change it had made. And it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon before anyone mentioned Mo Mullen, the architect of the Good Friday Agreement. And somebody phoned in and said, what about Mo Mullen? And then in the studio they all went, oh yeah, she was brilliant, she was the architect of the agreement. And then they started talking about Mo Mullen. And so it demonstrated to me that it's still going on. And of course, to get back to that cheeky wee bastard in the school, right? That this is a problem for everyone, because it's about where we come from as a society, as a culture. We have to start telling these more interesting and more diverse stories, because we don't come from one place. Our history in Scotland is not even all in English. You know, our history happened in English and Scots and Gaelic, and we have to start representing that to ourselves and owning the whole of our history. So I think it is a real problem. And I think it's something that Edinburgh's trying to work on. Edinburgh finds it very difficult. Edinburgh's a city that looks back. Edinburgh's a sort of heritage hub. We don't have this problem in Glasgow, by the way. There's 7 statues of women in Glasgow already in the city centre. There's none in Edinburgh to name women who aren't royal.
Isn't there a struggle over the Sandy Stoddart proposed
There
statue?
is, and I feel terribly sad about it. Everyone in the room, I'm sure, will want a statue of Elsie Ingalls. Whether we want that statue or not is quite another thing. I certainly don't. I think we're turning Edinburgh into an Alexander Stoddart's sort of theme park, really. And we need to preserve the visual diversity of our capital city. It's very important. So I feel really disappointed. I really don't like the design of the statue either. But let's see what happens. So yeah, that would be great to get the first statue. It would be really good if it was a good one, though. Has anyone else got a question?
I got a point.
Oh.
Susan Ferrier,
Oh yeah.
who is one of the forgotten writers of Edinburgh, wrote an amazing book called Marriage, which is a very clever spoof of Jane Austen, but also of this romantic notions that have developed,
Yes.
partly by Scotland, about Scotland and what it was like. And I think it's a marvellous book.
It's a really good book. So when Susan Ferrier's first book came out, it was written anonymously.
Yes, that's right.
And
yeah.
everyone thought it was Walter.
That's right.
And he said, oh no, nobody could, I would know this is a much better writer than I am. I have to say he was right. She's a really good writer. She wrote a book called Destiny as well as one of her other books. And another Edinburgh writer actually broadly in the era that I think was really amazing is Mary Brunton. So Mary Brunton wrote, she's sort of gritty, dirty Jane Austen. I highly recommend it. I think she's really fabulous. Her husband was Alexander Brunton, who, after she died, went on to be the moderator of the Church of Scotland Assembly. So she was born in Orkney, and she eloped with him when they were much younger. So it's a great sort of romantic story around her. And I think she's another great lost writer to the city. Yeah.
I was just wondering, Sarah, if I could ask a little bit more about your writing, both in the Fair Botanists, and also it's lovely to hear that sort of excerpt, hot off the press. You're writing of Charlotte, because I think, particularly the passage you just read out there, I found that really interesting to think about Charlotte. I think we so often think about her in relief to Scott and her kind of capacity and relationship to Scott, but hearing that passage there was a lot more about her as an individual, as a person. And I just wonder, in terms of finding those traces of her, what that was like and where they were to be found.
It's really interesting because sometimes they're just not there, and you have to take a look and say, I think she maybe had a salmon pink frock, she looks like she would have suited one. Or you see a frock somewhere in a collection. I'm very big into fashion history. You see a frock somewhere in a collection and you think, I'm going to give that to so-and-so, because it's of the era, it's of the era, the frock existed, and therefore I'm going to give it to this particular character. Sometimes what I try and do, one of the things I try and do certainly, is to include more of the women for the women. She's buying Veuve Clicquot champagne. Later on, it's actually not Charlotte, it's one of the Mackenzie sisters, is reading a Susan Ferrier novel. These women were famous within their day, and we come to sort of forget about them a bit. We don't really, as soon as they're gone, they're gone. And so it's to bring the balance back, almost. Other times, you go into the artefact store at the National Museum of Scotland and you discover that there is something there. There's a dressing table set, or there might be a painting or an engraving of somebody. And then you start to work with that and say, well, actually, what earring is that person wearing, or what's that necklace? Or you start to look at that and try and figure out. It's quite scary as well, thinking what will be left of us, because it's very random. Things disappear, and it's incredibly random how things disappear. So you might think, oh, I'm going to leave my, I'll be leaving this, and this, and what ends up getting left is a hat. And somebody has to create your whole character, some poor future historical novelist, from this hat that is left. And so we can only really make our best guess. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find, journals and papers. There's a really exciting thing that I love that happens in the archive. Archives, it can be quite boring. You go in, you have to read a lot of material to find something that you're really going to use. And quite often they bring you up a dusty old box, and nobody's maybe opened that box for 100 or 200 years. And you open up the box and you start to read and you think, oh, I can't believe they don't let me have sandwiches in here. You're in there for ages and you're a bit bored. And then you open a journal or you unfold a letter, and there is somebody telling you about breakfast they've just had, or that they just saw an elephant for the first time, or that they're sewing a particular jacket for somebody, or that they're really worried about their mum, and it just brings that person standing right next to you. And it is a particular sadness to me that oftentimes in archives female material is not kept. Granny's letters are not considered as important as Grandad's letters, they're just not. And so quite often, because the curatorship has been very male, very white, very straight, very whatever, and those people haven't valued those items, and so those items get chucked out or thrown away, or they don't remain. So there is a real dearth. Bethany Hughes, who's an amazing historian, you've probably seen her on television, did a study for Historic England must be nearly 10 years ago now. And she estimated that only less than 1% of material in our archives is actually of women. We just don't keep it. The annoying thing about the book I want to write is set in the zoo, I'm still going to write this book. I know asthmatic penguins are not glamorous, but I love them. One of the things I was looking at was suffragette banners. And I went to go and find a suffragette banner. So these are the banners that the suffragettes sewed, and then they marched under them. Hugely historic artefacts, and it turned out that many of the suffragettes had turned up at museums and said, would you like to have our banner? And the curators had said, what do we want your dirty old banner for? I was at the People's Palace in Glasgow before it closed, and there in the distance was the suffragette banner. And I thought, oh my God, I'm finally going to see one of these suffragette banners. Went running up, and it was the banner the men who had supported the women had marched under, because that was worth keeping. And that's the patriarchy. So for the women and for any sort of subdivision or subset of people, it's always more difficult to find that material. You have to read between the lines, you have to make a decent guess, and sometimes all you're left with is objects, not even words, and you have to try and understand someone from their hat, their dressing table set, a favourite book or a Bible sometimes that they have, and just do your best with it.
You'll know Philippa Gregory's book,
Yes.
Every Woman. Well, she studied at Edinburgh, and she did the research for her first historical novel in Edinburgh, and she said it actually formulated the way she wrote her novels enormously.
What
All
Edinburgh did.
experience, yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
I think Edinburgh's quite unique in that it is a city that just so values its heritage. I remember being brought up with this idea that we are an Enlightenment city. And it's actually to the detriment of other cities that were also Enlightenment cities. When I got to Glasgow, I found out it was an Enlightenment city, but that's not their main focus. In Edinburgh, we still talk about it. And the city centre is tremendously static because it is a heritage site, which is really important and very beautiful. But Edinburgh can't move forward in the same way as some other cities. And that's quite interesting now that I live in Glasgow. Sacrilege to say, but it's a hugely dynamic city centre there. Changes all the time, and that's actually quite exciting. And so to be in a city that faces forward and only looks back now and again is quite a different experience for me creatively. And I'm sort of thinking a lot at the moment about the way that must have affected Alistair Gray, actually, that he lived in an environment that was changing and that he felt he had to capture as it changed in his paintings, Cowcaddens, for example. Oh, 3 at once. 23. Would you like?
Well, slightly to revert to the statues of women in Edinburgh, opposite our house in North Charlotte Street is the Eleanor Cross to Catherine Sinclair.
Yeah.
And so with my 4 children, I've always talked something about the inscriptions on it. Though her face isn't there, I don't think, but it's absolutely a monument to a Scottish female writer.
Yeah.
But the thing I can't quite remember, but others here may recall, is that in it being designed, there was to be an echo of the Scott Monument, but it was for a woman, and they didn't actually want to have her face on it, and I don't know whether you've ever come into that. However, I love looking out of my sitting room window and seeing the top of this Gothic in the middle of
I think
classical
you're going to like the
Edinburgh.
Jillkeepers, sir, because it happens on Glenfinnan Street, so it's in,
Yes.
it's in your hood.
Yes, it
It's
is.
very much in your hood.
Yeah.
So the monuments gentleman's talking about is to Charlotte Sinclair, who was primarily remembered now for being a children's writer. She wrote a book called Holiday House, which was a fantastically successful Victorian children's book. They have a copy of it in the Charlotte Square in the Georgian House, if you want to go and see it. And Lizzie Hills is telling me there she has a copy as well. And this monument was put up. It's not a statue, and most people don't even know it's to a woman. So if you're looking for things that, as a child, it's very kind of you to tell your kids, but if you're looking for things that, as a child, show female achievement, it doesn't really show that in the same kind of way, but I'm very glad it's there. I did include it. I included the monuments that do exist within Where Are the Women? So the Catherine Sinclair, sort of, it's like a little Gothic sort of steeple almost, isn't it? Is in the book, and I'm very glad it's there. And she was quite amazing, but it's not immediately apparent. It's not like all big brass men on Old George Street. Let's put it like that.
squeeze in one final. Just one question.
I take your point about Scott, the patriarchy approach, but what do you think of the Heart of Midlothian, where he makes the main character a woman with agency, and of course Queen Caroline also has sort of agency. That's the nearest he got, I think, too.
Yeah, he did. And I mean, he loved women. He supported women all the way through. He's one of the very generous writers who would say, about Susan Ferrier's book. She's a better writer, and Jane Austen, she's a better writer than I am, and all this kind of thing. He's the benevolent patriarchy. That's the benevolent patriarchy. So he does use his privilege fairly well, but still think maybe he shouldn't have had all the privilege.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, first of all, for a really fascinating talk, taking us into your writing practice and what led you to writing Walter and Charlotte and that Edinburgh world as well. And also thank you for delving into those questions so thoroughly with us as well. But to thank you properly, to pass over to David McClay, always right at the back there, to give the future thanks.
Shall I move over here?
Yeah, sure. I was so busy I had to sit at the back, which is a wonderful thing. Hopefully that will continue into future events we have. And we do have a few people along this evening who aren't regular attenders at the club, so please do speak to Lucy, myself or Lee in the social part that follows if you're interested in joining up with the club. I'm not here to whip up trade, I'm here to thank our speaker this evening. Sarah and I first met, I was trying to work it out, I think it was probably 2010 when I was working at the National Library of Scotland, and she came in to explore the archives. And what struck me first of all was just what a natural storyteller you were. Just from having a coffee with you and talking, and it was an echo of what we got tonight. Your personal background, your enthusiasm for writing, what type of sources you were looking for, what type of stories you wanted to tell. I have to say, not every researcher that comes to an archive or a library has as much enthusiasm or as much unfocus. Because you didn't say, I'm looking for letters by this person. It was like, I want to find out the hidden story of this person, or I want to tell the story of these forgotten people, which is very challenging for an archivist or a curator to direct you in the right way. But you had the perseverance to ferret out those sources and to tell those stories. And to see your career you were already well known at that point. I think it was James Wellstead. It was the first one you wrote. So not 1820s Edinburgh, but 1830s Arabia, Secret of the Sands. But to see you go on year after year, getting better and better, I think, exploring even more stories and bringing so much of history to life. Not just the cities, and Edinburgh and the Age of Scott is one which we are particularly interested in, but all the other places that you're able to weave together. But you clearly have a passion for Edinburgh in that period, and it's such a fertile ground to explore. I know you've enthused me not only to look at Edinburgh and Edinburgh's history in a different way, to see the hidden people whose voices perhaps haven't been heard in the past as often as they should do. I also can't wait to go to the Botanics again, and possibly also to the zoo, where hopefully the penguins are all in fine health. I think if you continue to explore the history of Edinburgh and of Scotland and the forgotten voices, you'll be writing even more novels than Scott, be as productive as he can. I wonder if I can take this vote of thanks just to ask a cruel question. I just wonder how your family feel about your obsessions with writing history, and if it's somewhat like Charlotte and Scott's obsession, if they suffer in a similar way. Yeah. You don't need to answer that just now. But if they do suffer, they suffer for a good cause, because you bring such a wonderful part of Edinburgh's history alive for us. And if you haven't read Sarah's works before, I'm sure you'll be looking forward to doing so, and the Botanist sounds like a good place to start. So on behalf of the club and the audience this evening, thank you so much for an enlightening and fascinating talk. Thank you.